Henrik Voss had stood at the East Wing corridor for 11 years. 11 years of marble floors and candlelight and the sound of nothing happening. He knew the creak of every floorboard. He knew which hinges needed oil. He knew the exact weight of silence that settled over the palace at 2 in the morning, when the last servant had gone to bed and the only breathing left was his own and the old buildings. He was not a man who noticed things out of place. That was, in fact, the entire point of him. A royal guard who noticed too much was a liability. A royal guard who kept his eyes forward, his mouth shut, and his questions to himself was an asset. Henrik had built his entire career on being exactly that kind of man. So, when he found the letter, he almost walked past it. It was tucked beneath the edge of a decorative urn near the end of the corridor. The one that held dried flowers nobody ever changed. Flowers so old they had gone from white to the color of old teeth. The corner of an envelope, cream-colored, slightly bent. It could have been anything. A note from a servant. A forgotten receipt. He had seen stranger things in stranger places. He picked it up because it was on the floor. That was his job. The floor was not a place for things. The seal on the back stopped him. He recognized the crest, not the royal family's crest, which he knew as well as his own face, but something older. A crest that appeared in the history books kept behind glass in the palace library, the ones no one was allowed to touch without cotton gloves. A crest that belonged to a family that, as far as anyone in official records was concerned, had ceased to exist 40 years ago. Henrik stood very still. The envelope was not sealed anymore. The wax had been broken, carefully, with something thin. Someone had already read this letter. Someone had already opened it, and, for reasons Henrik could not yet explain, had placed it back, half hidden. Beneath the urn of dead flowers in the corridor, no one but guards walked after midnight. He should have taken it directly to his commanding officer, Colonel Brandt. That was protocol. That was 11 years of training speaking in a voice he knew well. He should have picked it up, carried it to the duty room, placed it on the desk, and then let someone with more authority decide what it meant. He opened it instead. The handwriting inside was a woman's, small, controlled, each letter formed with the precision of someone who had learned to write as a discipline rather than a pleasure. The ink was not fresh. This was not a letter written today or yesterday. The paper had the faint, yellowed quality of something kept in a drawer for years, taken out so many times that the fold lines had softened into the texture of cloth. But he read it once. Then he read it again, standing alone in the corridor at 2 in the morning with the candlelight making shadows of his hands. The letter was addressed to no one by name. It began simply, "You need to know what was decided before you were born." And what followed was not a love letter, not a threat, not any of the ordinary things letters found in palace corridors tended to be. What followed was a confession, a detailed, careful, a deliberately written account of a decision made at the highest level of the royal household 40 years ago. A decision that, if the letter was genuine, changed the answer to a question that Henrik had never thought to ask: who, exactly, was sitting on the throne? He folded it. He put it in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket against his chest, where he could feel it with every breath. He finished his shift. He nodded at the morning guard. He walked to his quarters. I sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Henrik Voss was 43 years old. He had a sister in the north who sent him bread at Christmas. He had a small savings account and a commendation from 8 years ago that hung on the wall above his desk, slightly crooked because the nail had never gone in straight. He was not a man built for the thing he was holding. He was not a man built for secrets that could end governments. And he took the letter out and read it a third time. The woman who had written it, and he was almost certain now who she was, though the letter bore no signature, described a night in the palace infirmary, a birth that had not gone as expected, 2 infants where one had been anticipated, a physician who had been brought in from outside the country, paid in cash, and sent home on a boat that did not carry his real name on the passenger list. A choice made by 3 people in a room, the 2 of whom were now dead, about which child would be presented to the court and which would be given to a family in the provinces with a new name and a story that held together just well enough that no one ever pulled on its threads. One of those children was now the monarch. The other one, the letter said, was somewhere still living. Had been living all this time under a name that was not theirs, in a life built on a foundation of someone else's decision. Henrik pressed his thumb against the fold of the paper. He thought about Colonel Brandt, who was a man of rules and procedures and who had 3 children and a pension to protect. He thought about what happened to people who brought news like this to the wrong ears first. He thought about the urn with the dead flowers and the careful way the seal had been broken, and the fact that someone had already read this letter and had not destroyed it, had instead placed it somewhere it could be found. That last part was the thing that wouldn't leave him alone. Someone had wanted it found. Someone had put it there deliberately, for someone specific, and had miscalculated, or had not miscalculated at all, and Henrik was exactly who they had intended to find it. He spent the next 6 hours going back through the last month in his memory the way you'd go through a box of old photographs, looking for the one that tells you something you missed. Every face he'd seen in that corridor, and every small deviation from routine that he'd logged in his head and then let go. There had been a woman, not a servant, dressed too well for that, but not a lady of the court either, dressed too practically for that, who had asked him 3 weeks ago to point her toward the gallery. He'd pointed. She'd thanked him. She'd walked away. He remembered now that she'd walked in the wrong direction. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Visitors got turned around in the palace constantly, and the East Wing was a maze even for people who worked there. But she hadn't been turned around, had she? She'd known exactly where she was going. She had wanted him to see her face. She had wanted him to be able to remember her later, when the time came. The time had come. He put the letter back in his jacket. He did not go to Colonel Brandt. He went instead to the palace archive, which opened at 8 in the morning and which he had visited exactly once before, years ago, for a background check on a new staff member. He told the archivist on duty that he was following up on a personnel record. The archivist was a young man who asked no questions and cared mainly about the paperwork being filled out correctly. Henrik filled out the paperwork correctly. He was given access to a reading room. He spent 3 hours in that reading room. He found the record of the royal birth, the official one, which said what everyone already knew, which described one infant, the healthy and strong, born at the proper hour and presented to the court the following morning. He found the name of the attending physician, a man from the capital who had died 12 years ago of a respectable old age. Then he found something that was not supposed to be in the file, a secondary entry written in a different hand, in a different ink, using a cataloging code that predated the current filing system. It had been overlooked or hidden in plain sight, or both. And a billing record for services rendered, noting a payment made to an unnamed external medical consultant for a date that matched the night of the royal birth, authorized by a name Henrik recognized as one of the 3 people the letter had described, one of the 2 who were now dead. He wrote nothing down. He memorized what he needed. He returned the files in perfect order, thanked the archivist, then walked back through the palace corridors with his hands loose at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had found exactly what he'd expected to find and felt entirely comfortable with it. Inside, something had shifted. He had spent 11 years standing still in a corridor, watching nothing happen. Something was happening now. The question was not whether he would act. He already knew, and somewhere beneath the rules and the training and the pension and the commendation on the wall, that he was going to act. The question was whether he was smart enough to survive it, and whether the woman who had placed that letter beneath the urn of dead flowers was a help to him or the first step in someone else's plan. He didn't know her name. Not yet. He knew her face. He knew the direction she had walked. He knew that she had come back into this building at least once since that day 3 weeks ago because the letter had not been there 2 nights before. He would have seen it. He always saw things on the floor. It was his one reliable talent, which meant she had placed it recently, within 48 hours, which meant she was close, which meant she was watching. He turned a corner in the corridor and stopped. The urn of dead flowers was exactly where it had always been. And he looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something ordinary that has stopped being ordinary. The way you look at a room after the furniture has been moved even slightly. Tucked beneath it, in the same spot, was another envelope. He had not been gone 3 hours. He reached down and picked it up. This one was sealed. New wax, fresh. His name, not his title, not Royal Guard, just Henrik. As if written by someone who had known him a long time, was written on the front in the same small, controlled handwriting. He stood there for a moment with the envelope in his hand. Then he put it in his jacket beside the first one, straightened up, and walked on down the corridor with his eyes forward and his face giving away nothing. Behind him, at the far end of the hall, a door that had been open a centimeter clicked softly shut. The second letter told him her name was Marta, and it told him nothing else about who she was, just Marta, and an address in the lower city written in a shorthand that assumed he would know the neighborhood, which he did because he had grown up 3 streets from it. That was not an accident. She knew where he was from. She had done her work before she had done anything else, and the fact of that, the patience of it, the preparation, settled somewhere in Henrik's chest, like a stone dropping into still water. He did not go that night. But he waited 2 full days. Not because he was afraid, though fear was present the way background noise is present in a room, always there, unacknowledged. He waited because he wanted to know if anyone else was watching the address before he showed up at it. He used his off-shift hours to walk through the lower city with no particular urgency, stopping for bread, stopping for coffee, taking routes that wound past the street in question without ever quite arriving there. Yet on the second day he was certain enough. No one who appeared near the address appeared twice. No one was watching the door the way a person watches a door they're assigned to watch. He knocked on the 3rd morning. Marta opened the door in the time it takes a person who has been standing just on the other side to reach a handle. She was older than he'd placed her in the corridor. Mid-50s, maybe. And with the kind of face that had been striking once and had settled into something better than striking. A face that looked like it had made a lot of difficult decisions and had made peace with most of them. She wore no jewelry. She looked at him the way you look at someone you've been waiting for long enough that relief and anxiety have become the same feeling. "You took longer than I thought," she said, not accusatory, just noting a fact. "I needed to be sure you weren't someone else's piece on a board," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "And are you sure?" He wasn't entirely, but he was sure enough, which was the closest he was going to get. He stepped inside. The apartment was small and precise. Books arranged by some system he couldn't immediately identify. A table with papers that she had turned face down before opening the door. He noticed the slight indent in the stack where her hand had rested on them. And the edges not quite aligned, the movement having happened fast. A single window looking out onto a courtyard where a cat sat on a wall doing nothing with total commitment. She made tea without asking if he wanted any. He sat down. She sat across from him. She told him that she had been a physician's secretary for 22 years. Not the physician who died 12 years ago, but the physician's former colleague. A woman who had spent the last decade trying to decide whether to take what she knew to her grave or hand it to someone who could do something with it. That woman, the colleague, had died 8 months ago. She had left everything to Marta, including the letters. "How many letters?" Henrik asked. "6. You have 2. The others are somewhere you cannot be led to yet." He accepted that. "Why me?" Marta wrapped both hands around her tea. Because you are the one guard in that palace who has not, in 11 years, taken a single favor, a single gift, a single private conversation with anyone who might want something from you later. You are boring in the most useful way a person can be boring." He thought about pointing out that boring people didn't typically sit in the lower city receiving secret letters about royal births from strangers. He didn't. She wasn't wrong. "What do you want to happen?" he asked instead. And that question seemed to cost her something. She looked at the turned-down papers on the table. She looked at the cat in the courtyard. She said, "I want the right person to know the truth. What they do with it. That is not something I am able to control, and I have stopped trying to decide it for them." The right person, meaning the one who was given away. Yes. Henrik sat with that. "You know where this person is." "I know where they were 12 years ago. When the colleague last confirmed it. A province in the north. A family named Anderson. A teacher's household." She paused. "I don't know if they're still there. I don't know what they know about themselves. I don't know if they have ever pulled on the threads of their own history, or if they have lived entirely inside the life they were given. And if they have," Henrik said, "if they're happy and settled and have never asked, what then? You would still hand them this?" Marta looked at him directly. "Would you not want to know?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. What he needed was to understand what the letters actually proved versus what they suggested. A handwritten confession from a dead woman, a billing record in an archive, a crest on an envelope. None of this was evidence in the sense that courts required. It was the shape of something, the outline of something. And the way a shadow is the outline of a person without being the person. Someone with the right motivation and the right lawyers could dismantle it in an afternoon. "There would need to be more," he said. "There is more." She stood and went to a cabinet behind the books, opened the back panel, not a hidden compartment, just a space that someone who didn't know to look would never look, and took out a flat box. Inside the box was a photograph, old enough to have gone sepia at the edges, of 4 people standing in a room Henrik recognized as the palace infirmary. 2 of them he knew from portraits. One of them was a man he did not know, which meant he was the outside physician, the one who had traveled under a false name. The 4th was a woman with her back half turned to the camera, caught in the middle of leaving, and you could not see her face. But you could see her hand. And on her hand was a ring with a crest, the same crest on the envelope. "Who was she?" Henrik asked. "The monarch's aunt. The one who died in what the official record calls a riding accident, 14 months after this photograph was taken." He set the photograph down very carefully. He understood now why the colleague had carried this for a decade without knowing what to do with it. This was not a family secret that could be handled quietly by the right administrator and buried in a file. This was a fault line running directly beneath the foundation of the current reign. And to move it was to risk everything on either side of it, and someone else was moving it. He was not naive enough to think that Marta and her dead colleague were the only people in the world who had arrived, by whatever path, at some version of this knowledge. Secrets at this level did not stay contained forever. They spread at the edges, they leaked, they attracted people who knew how to exploit them. "Has anyone else approached you?" he asked. The pause before she answered was small but present. "A man. 6 weeks ago. He said he represented interested parties. He was not specific about the nature of the interest." "What did you tell him?" "That I had nothing. That I was a former secretary living on a modest pension with no knowledge of anything concerning." "Did he believe you?" "No." Henrik exhaled through his nose. The shape of the situation was becoming clearer, and it was not a comfortable shape. There was a live investigation happening somewhere above him. Not official, not legal, the other kind. And Marta was already a known quantity to whoever was running it, which meant the address he was sitting in was already compromised, which meant he had probably been seen coming here even if he hadn't been followed in the conventional sense, which meant the clock that had started the moment he picked up the first letter was running faster than he'd understood. "Hide the letters in the other location," he said. "Are they safe where they are?" "For now. We need to move them." "I know. And we need to find the person in the north before whoever sent that man to your door finds them first." Marta looked at him across the table with an expression he couldn't fully name. It was not quite relief, and not quite dread, and not quite the satisfaction of a plan reaching the stage it had always been building toward, but something that held all three without becoming any of them. "I was hoping you would say that," she said. He left the apartment separately from the way he had arrived, using the courtyard entrance that opened onto a different street. He didn't look back at the building. He kept his hands loose. He kept his face ordinary. He had one more shift before his next scheduled rest day, 2 days from now. 2 days in which he had to continue standing in the corridor with his eyes forward. He nodding at the right moments, being the exact same man who had stood there for 11 years, while inside his jacket he carried 2 letters that made that version of him feel like a costume he was wearing over something he hadn't yet learned the name of. That night, alone in his quarters, he unfolded the photograph and looked at it for a long time. The ring on the half-turned woman's hand caught the light even through 40 years of photographic age. He thought about the teacher's household in the north. He thought about a child growing up with a name that was not theirs, in a life that was not the one they had been born into, learning their lessons and eating their dinners and perhaps standing at a window sometimes with a feeling they had never been able to explain, a sense of something not quite fitting, not quite wrong but not quite right either, the way a word feels when you know it means something but can't remember what. He thought about what it would mean to arrive at someone's door with the truth of their life in an envelope. He thought about whether truth owed anything to the happiness it was walking into and destroying. He put the photograph back. He set his alarm for 5:30. At 2 in the morning, when the palace was quiet and the corridors held only the sound of his own footsteps, he made his way to the east wing and stood in front of the urn with the dead flowers. He stood there for a moment, not touching it, just looking, a habit of checking, a need to know if anything had changed. Nothing under the urn, nothing on the floor around it, but the dead flowers. He had walked past these flowers for years. White flowers, gone the color of old teeth, never changed. He knew them. He would have told you with complete confidence that he knew exactly what they looked like. There were 7 stems. There had always been 7 stems. There were now 8, as someone had placed a single fresh white flower among the dead ones, so recently that it had not yet begun to wilt. Placed carefully, at the back, where it would take a close look to catch. A signal or a message or a marker, he didn't know which, left by someone who had been in this corridor tonight. Henrik stood very still. Behind him, the entire weight of the palace breathed in and out in the dark. The fresh flower was a warning or an invitation, and the only way to tell the difference between those two things was to follow it and find out. Henrik spent his last shift before the rest day doing something he had never done in 11 years of palace service. He started paying attention to everyone, not in the way that guards are trained to pay attention, for threats, for weapons, for the wrong kind of movement, but differently. He paid attention the way you read a room when you're trying to understand what conversation happened just before you walked in. Who was near the east wing in the hours before his 2 in the morning check? Who might have reason to be there and reason to stay invisible about it? By mid-morning, he had narrowed it to 3 people. By afternoon, 1. A woman named Elsa Kern, who held the position of records liaison, the kind of role that sounds administrative and is administrative, whose entire point is to be the last person anyone thinks about. She moved through the palace with the practiced invisibility of someone who had cultivated it deliberately. She had access to the archive. She had access to the East Wing during evening hours for a filing task that had apparently been ongoing for several weeks. Henrik had nodded at her in corridors dozens of times and registered nothing because she had given him nothing to register, which was itself a kind of skill. And he did not approach her at work. He found out where she took her lunch. She was sitting alone at a table near the window of a small cafe 2 blocks from the palace, eating something she clearly wasn't tasting, reading nothing, looking at the middle distance. She glanced up when he sat down across from her and did not look surprised, which told him everything about whether the flower had been meant for him specifically. "You left the flower," he said. "I left the flower," she said. Why?" She set down her fork. "Because the man Marta described to you, the one asking questions 6 weeks ago, he's been inside the palace. He has a credential, a consulting credential, issued by someone in the administrative office who I suspect does not know what they authorized." She paused. "He's been in the archive." Henrik kept his face even. "What did he take?" "Nothing I can prove. But the billing record you found and the secondary entry, and it's been moved. Still in the file. A different location in the file. Someone handled it and put it back, and they put it back in the wrong place." She said this with the flat precision of a person whose entire professional identity is knowing where things belong. "He knows it exists. He may have photographed it." The shape of things was shifting again. Someone running a private investigation with a palace credential, access to the archive, and now confirmation of the billing record. That was not a journalist. Or that was not a historian with curious ethics. That was either someone protecting the throne or someone planning to use what they found against it, and those two things could share all the same methods right up until the moment they diverged. "Who does he work for?" Henrik asked. "I don't know yet. I've been careful not to look too directly." She picked up her fork again, put it down again. "There are 2 possibilities that concern me. The first is that he works for people who want to suppress this, who have known for years that these letters existed, who have been waiting for them to surface so they can disappear them. And the second? That he works for people who want to use the living heir as a political lever. Not to restore anything, to destabilize the current reign at a moment of their choosing." Henrik absorbed this. Neither possibility was good. They both made the person in the north a target, either for erasure or for exploitation. Both made Marta a liability who would eventually need to be silenced one way or another by whoever was moving their pieces. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Days, maybe less." She met his eyes. "The letters you don't have yet, they're the ones that would matter most in any legitimate proceeding. Medical confirmation, witness accounts, the name and location of the family the child was placed with. If he gets those before you do, the story ends." "Where are they?" she told him. "Not an address, a location in the palace itself. A place so obvious that it functioned as a hiding spot because no one who understood hiding spots would think to look there. The portrait gallery on the 2nd floor, behind the largest gilt frame, which had been attached to the wall by a previous archivist with more space than was structurally necessary, creating a gap just wide enough for a flat envelope. "Left there," Elsa said, "by the colleague before she died. On a visit she'd made to the palace under the guise of a historical preservation consultation, during which she had spent 45 minutes alone with the portraits and come out looking like a woman who had just set down something very heavy. The gallery was accessible. Henrik had regular rotation through it. And the question was whether he could move the letters before the man with the consulting credential thought to look behind gilt frames. He went that evening during the window between the afternoon cleaning and the evening lighting check, when the gallery sat empty for exactly 23 minutes. He knew the window because he had covered that rotation 14 times in the last 2 years. He walked to the largest frame, slid his hand behind it, and found the envelope without having to search. "I've 4 letters, folded together, bound with a piece of string so old it left a rust-colored mark on his glove. He did not read them there. He pocketed them, made the rest of the rotation, and filed his check log with the same handwriting and the same timing as every other evening. That night he read them alone in his quarters with the door locked. The 4th letter was a notarized statement. The physician who had operated under a false name had, in the last year of his life, written and had signed before a notary a full account of what he had been hired to do, what he had done, and the name and location of the family to whom the second infant had been given. He had done this, the statement said, because he was not a man who could take the knowledge to a grave he was approaching and leave it there undisturbed. The family name was Anderson. The province was exactly as Marta had said, and the name the child had been given, had grown up with, and had presumably built a life with, was written clearly in the physician's careful old hand. Lars Anderson, age 40 at the time of the statement, which made him 52 now if he was living. Lars Anderson, who was, by the account of a dead physician, a dead woman's letters, a billing record in a misplaced file, a photograph with a ringed hand, the firstborn child of a royal birth that had been hidden for 52 years. Henrik sat with that name for a long time. In the morning, as on his rest day, he took a train north. He had thought about this decision in the hours before sleep, rolling it over and over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for a flat side. He had considered sending Marta instead. He had considered sending no one, and instead going directly to someone with legal standing to act. A judge, a constitutional scholar, a member of the oversight committee. And he had considered doing nothing and waiting to see if the man with the consulting credential moved first, and then following the movement. Every option except going himself required trusting something he couldn't fully trust yet. Every option except this one put Marta, or the letters, or Lars Anderson himself at the end of a chain that had too many links and too many points of failure. He was a guard. This was what guards were for. Not standing still, standing between. But the province was 4 hours by rail. He arrived in the early afternoon in a town that smelled of pine and cold water, where the streets were wide and quiet, and the school building sat at the edge of a square with a clock tower that had been stopped for what looked like several years. He had the address from the physician's notarized statement, cross-referenced with a provincial directory he had checked before boarding the train. The man who opened the door was tall, and broad through the shoulders, with gray beginning at his temples, and the careful eyes of someone who had spent a career watching young people figure out who they were. He had none of the features that the royal portraits would have prepared Henrik for. He looked entirely and convincingly like what he had been told he was his whole life, a provincial schoolteacher's son who had gone on to teach himself, except his hands. The shape of his hands was one Henrik had walked past every day for 11 years, cast in marble on the second-floor landing of the East Palace wing, in a sculpture of the old king that every visitor stopped to look at. Henrik asked if he could come in. Lars Anderson stepped back from the door with the mild, patient politeness of a man accustomed to students arriving with complicated problems, and Henrik walked into a small hallway that smelled of coffee and paper, and then thought, this man has no idea, not even a thread of it. He has lived his entire life in a seamless story, and I am about to pull out the seam. He sat down at a kitchen table. Lars Anderson sat across from him. Between them, Henrik placed the letters, the notarized statement on top, the photograph beneath it, the original confession beneath that. I'm going to tell you something, Henrik said, and I need to tell you all of it before you respond, because the parts need each other to make sense. Lars looked at the stack of papers. Something in his face. Not recognition, not memory, but a quality of stillness, the stillness of a person who has felt for a very long time that some question was living just beyond the edge of their sight, shifted slightly, like a door that had always been there that someone had finally decided to knock on. "All right," he said. Henrik told him, all of it. And he kept his voice level and his pace even, and he did not rush the hard parts, and he did not soften them either. He laid it out the way you lay out a map, not asking anyone to walk it yet, just making visible the terrain that had always been there. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the clock tower that had been stopped for several years stood against an afternoon sky the color of old paper. Lars Anderson looked at the letters for a long time without touching them, or he looked at the photograph. He looked at the physician's notarized statement with his own name written in it. He said nothing for long enough that Henrik began to understand that silence could hold more truth than speech, that some things arrived and simply needed to sit in the room for a while before the person they had arrived for could decide what they weighed. Then Lars reached out and picked up the photograph with both hands. With both of those hands that looked like carved marble in a palace 200 miles south. And he looked at it the way a person looks at something they have always known, without knowing that they knew it. Henrik did not ask him what he would do. He did not press for a decision or a response or an indication of what came next. He had brought what he'd been carrying. He had set it down where it belonged. He thought about Marta, waiting in the lower city, but he thought about the man with the consulting credential who would find, when he went back to the archive, that a certain file had been re-examined, and would begin to understand that someone was ahead of him. He thought about Colonel Brandt and the duty room and the commendation on the wall hanging slightly crooked because the nail had never gone in straight. He thought about the corridor. 11 years of standing still in a corridor. See, Lars set the photograph down on the table and looked at Henrik with the careful, measured expression of a man who has just been handed the one question his whole life was quietly built around, and who is deciding, in this moment, in this kitchen, in this small town 4 hours north by rail, whether he is ready to ask it out loud. Outside the window, the stopped clock stood against the afternoon sky. It had no answer either, but it was there, and it was solid. And in the particular stillness of that moment, it seemed less like a thing that had broken than like a thing that had simply been waiting, holding its position, pointing at a specific hour, for the moment when the right person finally came to set it moving again. Henrik waited. Lars opened his mouth.